ADHD and depression are very different conditions, but they can look shockingly similar from the outside to such a degree that even a trained clinical psychologist like myself sometimes has trouble telling them apart. However, despite what some people in my field might say, the differential diagnosis and getting a correct label for your symptoms is not arbitrary. It's not just a semantic thing. It actually makes, or can make at least, I should say, a tremendous difference. Because although ADHD and depression can have a lot in common on the surface, what is going on underneath to cause those relatively similar looking symptoms is actually quite different in one condition versus the other. Therefore, they are treated quite differently in one condition versus the other. ADHD is primarily treated through the use of stimulant medication that increases brain functioning in areas of the brain that are shown to have diminished activity in people with ADHD. There are a couple non-stimulant options, but it's mostly stimulant medication. Depression, on the other hand, can be treated through antidepressant medications, some off-label medications like some antipsychotics, individual therapy, or probably ideally a combination of medication and therapy for most people. So if you get the wrong diagnosis and you get the wrong treatment, best case scenario, you probably don't get better. Worst case scenario, your symptoms might actually worsen because the part of the brain that's being acted upon, or the thing you're spending time on trying to work on, isn't actually addressing the underlying problem. Further complicating this differential is that ADHD and depression, to some degree, can actually kind of cause one another. If you are depressed, you probably notice that when you feel depressed, you experience a lot of ADHD-like symptoms. Depression, both directly through disruption of neurotransmitter functioning and indirectly through disruption of your daily routines, things like sleeping, eating, physical activity, makes your brain not work as well as it normally does. It causes a lot of mental or cognitive dysfunction. You feel slower, foggier, more forgetful, more distractible, and so you can look very much like a person with at least inattentive type ADHD. ADHD, on the other hand, can cause a lot of depressive symptoms. When you start to become aware that your functioning seems to be just a little bit different than other people, when you start to notice, man, I forget things a lot, or I have trouble doing things all the way, or I'm kind of falling behind either on certain tasks or just like on life in general, you often develop a lot of feelings like guilt or shame, a lot of negative self-talk, maybe low self-esteem, and those things can look very much like a depressed person. And of course, because this isn't complicated enough already, some people, many people in fact, legitimately have both ADHD and depression as technically separate conditions that do still feed off of one another and exacerbate one another to a degree. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about why these two things can be so difficult to tell apart and how they do look very similar. But I'm also going to talk about how to tell them apart because, again, I really do believe that does matter. And what I'm going to leave you guys with at the end of this piece of content is what you can do if you're either still not sure or if you have both. In other words, what are some universally beneficial techniques for people who experience a lot of these kind of overlapping symptoms and don't know exactly what they should be targeting? Before I get into the similarities between ADHD and depression, there's an important reminder I want to give you guys, which is that both ADHD and depression are actually umbrella terms. They are both actually categories of diagnoses, not specific diagnoses in and of themselves. So ADHD actually refers to three distinct diagnoses, three subtypes, I should say. There is hyperactive type ADHD. A lot of people might think about this as like classical ADHD. This one usually doesn't look as much like depression. Hyperactive type ADHD is comprised of symptoms like restlessness, fidgeting, difficulty sitting still, running or climbing when it's not appropriate, extreme impatience, talking over people a lot, interrupting people a lot, and basically it just looks like someone who's like really high energy and obviously hyperactive. There's also inattentive type ADHD, and this is what the vast majority of people would call ADD. This is someone who has trouble with executive functioning. So that's things like focus, concentration, memory, organization, time management. They might procrastinate a lot, have trouble keeping track of their stuff, have difficulty listening and staying engaged in conversations, but they don't necessarily experience the hyperactive symptoms of ADHD. And this inattentive type ADHD in particular is the one that does tend to look a lot like depression in some cases. The third ADHD subtype is combined type ADHD. So many people have prominent symptoms of both inattention and hyperactivity. On the depression side of things, depression is not actually a diagnosis. There is no diagnosis in the DSM called depression. Most people, when they say, I have depression, or are talking about depression, are typically referring to major depressive disorder, which is an episodic mood disorder when a person's mood fluctuates between like a generally normal moods, like you feel okay, you feel, you react typically to life experiences and stressors, and depressed mood, which is when we feel very low energy, low motivation, very down on ourselves. Life feels kind of pointless or worthless. We have a lot of trouble getting going, and we kind of have some ups and downs to that degree. And for some people, the depressive episodes are like 95% of their life, and so they seem depressed pretty much all the time. And the non-symptomatic periods are very infrequent. There's also, of course, bipolar disorder, which is another episodic mood disorder, but the episodes can fluctuate between depressed mood, normal mood, and manic episodes, which can look a lot like hyperactive type ADHD, but that's another piece of content for another day. Some people have persistent depressive disorder, which is sort of like a chronic low-grade depression. The symptoms are typically more in the mild to moderate range. You don't see like quite the extreme life impairment where the person like can't get out of bed at all or is like severely suicidal. But it's a person who just doesn't get a lot of joy from life, just doesn't really enjoy being here very much. And it's just kind of a flat, low mood that is chronic and not episodic and doesn't really move up and down a lot. Then you've got things like PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is sort of like a depression mixed with anger that correlates with a woman's menstrual cycle. So when we say depression, I'm talking about a huge category of things that can look very different from one person to the next. And so I'm going to be speaking very much in generalities here. So whether you have ADHD or depression or both, if some of what I'm saying today, some of what I'm describing as a symptom or as an overlap, if you're listening to it and you're like, that doesn't sound like me at all, that's like a horrible mischaracterization of my condition, I'm speaking about, millions of people. So not all of it may sound like you, and that's not me trying to discredit or invalidate your experience. It really just reflects the limitations of our current diagnostic system. So all of that being said, what ADHD and depression have in common, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, this is just the things I see the most often, is a general sense of being overwhelmed by daily life. So people with both conditions tend to just look at like a fairly typical day, like I have my home, I have my body, I have my job, maybe I have a family, maybe I'm in school, and you just look at all the things that entails, and you tend to look at it and be like, that's too much. I don't know if I can do that. The reasons for that appraisal are different, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there tends to be a general sense of like life is just a little bit too much for me, or maybe a lot too much for me. Maybe some of the time, maybe all of the time. And on a related note, there tends to be impaired productivity that is often misinterpreted as laziness by other people with both depression and ADHD. The classic sort of underachiever label is often applied to people in both conditions here. So you might see somebody who is, performing academically or occupationally or even just at home, like on a lower level than what they seem to be capable of cognitively or intellectually. It's like there's this gap between what this person should be able to do and what this person is actually doing. And again, that tends to be like really mischaracterized by other people. And you might get a lot of negative feedback about like, you can do this, so why aren't you doing it? As if a person's, intellect, for example, is the only barrier to struggling with productivity, which of course it is not. Obviously, I kind of said this before, but both depression and ADHD do typically involve some degree of impaired executive functioning. So that's difficulties with focus, concentration, and memory. Like a short attention span is very characteristic of both. Like you just can't do one thing for that long. We tend to be very prone to distractions in both cases, where if I'm trying to focus on something and there's like a lot going on around me, I have a really hard time tuning that out and sticking with this thing. A lot of forgetfulness, not long-term, Neither ADHD nor depression, in and of themselves, have any real impact on long-term memory. It's the short-term memory that they tend to cause problems with. So you may remember as well as anybody else what happened in your life 5 years ago, but you have a lot of trouble remembering like 5 seconds ago or 5 minutes ago. Chronic procrastination tends to be a major hallmark of both. Like, I know what I should be doing. I know I should be writing this paper. I know I should be organizing this room. I know I should be working on this project. But there seems to be, everyone procrastinates sometimes, right? I'm not saying procrastination is inherently pathological, but there are larger gaps with both depression and ADHD between like the internal stimulus of I should be doing this thing and the actual response and action of I am doing this thing. The latency tends to be exponentially greater, like 2, 3, 4, even 10x what it might be for a person who doesn't have these conditions. Both ADHD and depression do typically create some degree of diminished social functioning. It can look a little bit different from one person to the next. People with ADHD are more likely to either like double commit themselves, like I told you I would hang out when I have class, or I told 2 different people I could get together with them at the same time, or just like forgetting you have plans with somebody and, staying home and missing out on something. With depression, it tends to come more from that place of anhedonia, that kind of lack of anything feeling worth it. Social functioning for most of us, especially if we're more on the introverted side of things, is a high cost activity, right? It's pretty draining. It's pretty difficult to do. And so if we don't feel like we're going to get a lot out of it, we might just be like, no, I'm not going to do that. Or say we're going to show up because we're people pleasers and then just, like not show up and ghost the person. And it's not always that we forgot, although it can be that because of the impaired executive functioning. But sometimes it's just like we just couldn't make ourselves do it. We didn't have the desire. We didn't have the motivation. It didn't feel worth it. Both conditions do tend to create a lot of low self-worth, feelings of low self-worth anyway. With ADHD, it's usually, I know I'm getting into a difference now, but with ADHD, it's usually a little bit more tied to like specific things. Like I am worthless because I forget important tasks at home and it's upsetting or problematic to my partner. Sometimes with depression, it's just like this nebulous, difficult to define thing. Like I'm just worthless because I'm worthless. Not always, but sometimes it's like it doesn't have to be connected to anything. It's just like this overwhelming, pervasive feeling that you get that doesn't really require like a rationale or a justification. Disorganized living spaces tend to be very characteristic of individuals with both ADHD and depression. So you've probably heard, if you've ever seen like depression pits versus like ADHD piles, these are both kind of common terms on social media. They pretty much look like the same thing for the most part. If I showed you a picture of, what was considered to be one or the other and asked you, is this a depression pit or is this an ADHD pile? I think for most people it'd be tough to tell the difference. There just tends to be a lot of difficulty in managing the kind of the physical and organizational structure of our living spaces. People with both conditions tend to feel like a burden to others or to society in general because we're pretty self-aware, right? Like we notice these patterns of underachievement. We notice these differences between ourselves and other people. We notice things that they can do that we can't. And we start to develop thoughts and feelings and even belief systems or complexes sometimes around that. And so we tend to feel like we're low value people. And lastly, at least as far as what I'm going to cover today, insecurity, indecision, and self-doubt tend to be very, very characteristic of both groups of people. We have a really hard time making decisions, especially big ones. We get a lot of that like analysis paralysis where I'm not sure what to do, and rather than making the decision that feels best, even if I'm not sure about it, sometimes people with both conditions are often likely to just like not make a decision at all and just, kind of whatever happens as a result of that is what happens. They're not doing it on purpose. It's just making decisions are very difficult for individuals with both conditions. So, as you can see, they have a tremendous amount in common, and that's why it's difficult, even for somebody like me, to be like, you have one or the other. There are some things that I've been able to figure out over the course of my career and getting to know a lot of people with one of or both conditions that have helped me be able to distinguish the two with, I think, a pretty high degree of accuracy, and I want to review those with you guys today as well. One of the biggest differences is that the lack of motivation and the lack of productivity in a depressed person versus a person with ADHD tends to focus on different aspects of the experience in different time frames. It's difficult for a person with ADHD to get going on a task that either doesn't seem very interesting or is going to take a long time, because they tend to think about their experience during the period of time. Like that won't be, and it's not always even like a conscious narrative experience. Sometimes it's more of just a feeling, but the feeling or the thought is often something along the lines of like, that won't be interesting. That won't hold my attention. I won't be able to stick with that for long enough to finish it. So there's no point in even really starting right now. With depression, it tends to be a little more focused on after and the lack of reward or achievement or joy or pride or whatever it may be after. So with depression, it might be like, yeah, maybe I could do that thing, but I will feel the same way after doing that thing that I feel right now, which is to some degree hollow, empty, miserable, and worthless. So if I have to expend energy to not change the way I feel, that feels like kind of a waste of energy. It feels like a waste of resources. It'll be meaningless, and who cares? Those two thought processes and emotion systems can kind of create the same behavior, but the underlying reason for the behavior is different. Another general difference between the two: ADHD people can also be very, very prone to mood swings, just as a person with depression can. But the mood swings experienced by a person with ADHD are usually triggered by failure or setbacks. So again, I gave you some examples before, but you get home and you realize you never put the laundry away like you had intended to, or you forget about a really important paper or presentation and you get a terrible grade because of it. You get a negative performance review at work because you're struggling with some aspect of your job. And there are these specific situations we encounter that like remind us, oh yeah, you're different than other people. You have trouble with this. This is harder for you than it is for most people. Depressive episodes can be triggered, but they do not require a trigger. And so the mood shifts that you see with depression sometimes have nothing to do with anything that's actually happening in a person's life. Like we can go to bed and feel fairly okay, wake up the next morning and just feel miserable and hollow and empty. And it's like, it's the same life. Like it's the exact same set of circumstances today as yesterday, but our feelings about those circumstances are very different. You don't typically see mood changes in a person with just ADHD with no trigger whatsoever. Like something has to happen, usually. The indecision that I mentioned that is characteristic of both conditions is they're almost polar opposites for what's happening on the inside. The indecision that people with ADHD experience usually comes from a perception of having too many options and being very uncertain about which one is correct or most likely to succeed. Whereas the indecision that people with depression experience tends to come from a perception of a lack of options, feelings of like powerlessness, like it doesn't matter, there's nothing I can do. So the visual in my head for each of these conditions is like, let's say you're walking on a path through the forest. The ADHD person gets to a point where there are 7 forks in the road, and suddenly there's a tremendous amount of pathways, and they're like, I don't know which one of these I'm supposed to go on. The person with depression, the path just terminates at like a brick wall that spans as far as the eye can see in both directions. So one is an excess of options, one is a lack of options, or at least the perception there. With ADHD, when something doesn't get done, the person with ADHD usually is still busy. They may not be busy on the highest priority items. They may not even be busy with things that matter at all necessarily, but that isn't always apparent in the moment. The things they're working on feel really important at the time, and it's often only with the benefit of hindsight that they're like, oh yeah, I should have been doing this instead of this, but I was doing this higher stimulation thing. With depression, we tend to have, not always, but tend to have longer periods of just like basically total inactivity. We're not sitting there thinking, I am doing something really important right now, and then it's like, oh, I should have been doing that instead. It's like, we're usually pretty aware, like, I'm doing nothing, or this thing that I'm doing is not important at all. We're aware of that. It just feels very difficult for us to intervene and get ourselves to do things. Depression, usually, if we're talking about major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, PMDD, depression is usually to some degree episodic. And so you'll see fluctuations in a person's functioning, in a person's mood, and that tends to be where some of the laziness label comes from. It's because we have these periods of time where we feel pretty good and we do pretty well, and then our mood tanks and our motivation tanks and we struggle, and people see us in those higher, less symptomatic or asymptomatic periods, and they're like, why can't you be like that all the time? And we're like, well, I would love to, but I don't know why I can't be like that all the time. It's not just that easy. ADHD generally is not an episodic thing. It's just kind of how your brain is like all the time. There can still be what appears to be an episodic component to it, because sometimes a person with ADHD will lock in on like a really, really high value task. And, if they can direct their hyper focus, because many people with ADHD, they have the short attention span for non-preferred tasks, but then they have the opposite end of the spectrum too, where it's like, well, if this is the thing I want to do, or that really stimulates my brain properly, I can actually do this longer than like the average person can. And sometimes things align such that your hyper focus is something, that's externally valuable to the world in general. Like maybe you have a paper on a thing that you're really interested in, or there's a thing at work that you love to do, and you'll absolutely crush that thing. Like you'll be above average at that thing. So it can look episodic, but it really isn't. It's just a matter of how stimulating the task at hand is. Depression tends to cause more physiological and energy changes than ADHD. So with depression, we also often see like low appetite, lethargic behavior, like difficulty engaging in physical activity. A person with inattentive type ADHD may have some of that as well. A person with hyperactive type ADHD not only probably doesn't have that, they probably have the inverse of that. Now, the one asterisk here, I should have mentioned this in similarities, but I glossed over it, is that both can experience insomnia. Now, again, the reasons are different. With ADHD, it's like I have too much energy, my brain won't shut off. With depression, it's just like I'm exhausted, but for some reason I can't sleep. But insomnia can be characteristic of both conditions. But you don't typically see like loss of appetite with ADHD, for example, other than as a side effect from stimulant medication. That is the most common side effect of stimulant medication. But ADHD in and of itself does not typically cause loss of appetite in individuals. So hopefully that information helps understand yourself, or if you're a professional, maybe helps you with some differential diagnoses. I promise you, though, I would end with some strategies that are helpful with both conditions. So if you're either still unsure about which of these is the correct label for your struggles, or you think, I think it's both of them. Like those literally both sound so much like me. I think it's not an either or situation. 4 things I'm going to give you here that can help with either condition. One is sleep hygiene. So both ADHD and depression ultimately have a lot to do with brain health and brain functioning and neurotransmitter functioning. And getting a good amount of high quality sleep is, honestly, it's pretty much a universally beneficial treatment technique. It works for almost anything. ADHD and depression are no exception. Both of these conditions will be improved. Your symptoms will be lessened, I should say, if you're able to sleep well. Now, I know it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing because we just talked about how both of them actually make it harder to sleep. But even if you can't achieve, optimal 8 hours of sleep at the exact same time every night kind of thing, working on your sleep hygiene will be mutually beneficial no matter what conditions you have. The same is true of physical activity. So that can be, stretching, running, weight training, sports, whatever it may be. All physical activity increases blood and oxygen flow to the brain, and that's going to improve cognitive performance. That's going to improve executive functioning. So it's going to help with your focus, your concentration, your memory, your organization, your social engagement. So that's another one, like it really doesn't matter what you have. It's just going to make your brain work better. A third technique that can be really helpful for both is creating systems where you have immediate gratification, because both ADHD and depression to a degree are characterized by difficulties achieving reward after engaging in tasks for different reasons, but it still kind of ends up being the same thing. And a lot of really important things that we do in life have no immediate gratification whatsoever. Like you when you finish that big paper, nothing happens right away. Like eventually it gets graded and hopefully you did well on it or whatever, you present it, and that's the payoff. But sometimes that's like weeks later, right? And so if you're trying to get yourself to do something, when you finally finish it, there is no reward. Nothing changes in your life. It doesn't help you do it again next time. So sometimes you have to be the one to create those rewards and create that instant gratification system, whether that's just verbal praise, whether you like buy yourself something. It can really help to reward yourself properly when the world itself isn't really set up to reward you for things. And the last mutually beneficial technique I want to talk to you guys about today is reducing your scope, because both ADHD and depression have a tendency to create feelings of being very overwhelmed by life, right? Like we talked about at the very beginning. One of the best ways to deal with feeling overwhelmed is to just take stuff off your plate, is to just care about less things. Whether that's like something on the logistical side of your life, like taking fewer classes or maybe working fewer hours, or just in your personal life. It could be like practicing minimalism to a degree. It could be owning less things so that you're not as overwhelmed by the state of your living space. It could be caring about fewer hobbies so you don't feel stretched so thin. It could even mean like shrinking your social circle a little bit if you feel overwhelmed by the number of social obligations you have. But just making yourself responsible for fewer things or not being stretched quite as thin in your life can be tremendously beneficial, whether you have depression or ADHD or both. Again, this was by no means meant to be an exhaustive presentation on these topics. This was meant to be simply an overview, but I sincerely hope this was valuable information for you. Let me know. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any other insight on how these two things can be different, because I know I didn't cover everything. Let's make this a mutual project. You guys can help me out. Anything I missed, give it to your peers here in the comments so they can use your information too. Take care, and I will see you next time.